Some look through this prism, seeking not to subtract, but to add. While Dr. Miller's experiments show promise in removing specific unwanted memories in early studies, we now turn to the possibility of adding content to the brain. Science fiction and fantasy have often contemplated what it might mean if we're able to add thoughts and memories to a person's narrative. And while this is still a long way off in humans, a new study does suggest it is possible to add a memory in laboratory conditions with certain animals, looking at our memories and how they're constructed, and a new method of artificial learning. We are joined by senior author Norman Weinberger, who's a research professor of neurobiology and behavior at UC Irvine. Welcome, Dr. Weinberger.
Thank you.
Starting with the basics, what do we know about the formation of memories and how they're stored in the brain?
There's no single memory center in the brain where all memories are stored. All of our memories are complex. They involve more than one sense ordinarily and may have emotional and other kinds of content. So the research to date overall suggests that each memory is stored in that part of the brain which processes the particular component. If it's a sound, it'll be processed and likely stored in the auditory system and so forth and so on. And all of these different parts of a memory then are apparently linked together in a complex network that's distributed throughout the brain.
Well, given that, it must be awfully complex not only to form these memories, but certainly to access them because there's all this crosswiring going on, right?
Well, actually, that helps because if a memory is composed of a lot of components, all you have to do is remember one component, and since they're linked, all the components are linked, it'll retrieve the other ones.
And that's why perhaps a smell might bring back a certain memory one day, whereas reading a line in a book might do it. And then sometimes the cue is lost because where it's being associated isn't being triggered versus the specific memory that we're trying to hunt for.
That seems likely.
So let's go actually to your study. You actually were able to, by manipulating the cerebral cortex, add memories in mice?
In rats.
In rats, excuse me.
Yes. We were able to do that after a long series of experiments that provided the foundation for that. It all begins with the finding from our laboratory several years ago that the way sensory cells in the cortex respond are not fixed. They're not given by the actual physical stimulus. It's not like striking a note on a piano and always getting the same result. And the auditory system, for example, doesn't work like a telephone line at all. Rather, the way that cells respond to sounds and other stimuli and other modalities is affected by what those sounds come to mean. If they're not important, then the responses tend to go down. If they are important, then the responses tend to go up. And so our brains are continually being retuned to emphasize those things that are important in our lives.
So in this case, is what you're doing accelerating the formation of a memory by triggering a stimulus and then triggering this hyper-response saying, remember this one, or is it something much more complex?
Well, it's a bit more complex than that because what we're doing is actually creating whatever memory we desire the animal to have. And that's done by relying on a chemical transmitter in the brain called acetylcholine. There are two kinds of chemical messengers in the brain, roughly speaking, two broad classes. One class sends specific messages about specific sensory experiences and so forth throughout the brain, and that carries the detailed content. But there's another set of molecules that actually modulates what the first set does, and that modulation can ordinarily make things work better. And acetylcholine is one of those molecules, and it's long been implicated in memory formation, although exactly how it works hasn't been understood. What we had done previously is to show that the cells in the auditory cortex get retuned to stimuli that are important, and that's been extended to all animals and even to humans. And then the next thing was to ask, well, is acetylcholine involved in that? And that was done by doing a microstimulation of a tiny part of the brain. It's called the nucleus basalis, and as the name implies, it's near the bottom of the brain. And that's where the cells that contain acetylcholine are congregated. And when you activate those cells, they release this transmitter throughout the brain, particularly in the cortex, which is where we're really thinking and talking to each other today. So it turned out that, yes, acetylcholine could actually produce the same kind of brain changes that happen in regular memory or natural memory. But then the third part is the part that we're talking about today, which is, well, wait a minute, how does acetylcholine do that? And so we asked whether or not it could actually increase the number of cells that process a particular experience, like a tone, a simple tone, because we had previously found that in natural learning, the more cells that process a stimulus, the stronger is the memory. So in this case, we did a very simple experiment, capitalizing on the fact that the auditory cortex of rats as well as humans is laid out in an interesting fashion. It's like the keys on a piano. The lower notes are located in one place, and the higher notes are located in another place, and the intermediate notes are adjacent or intermediate. So you have essentially a little map of acoustic frequency right in the brain. So it's possible then to record from the brain and find out where the cells are tuned or what they prefer. So we did a very simple study. We gave the animal a particular tone, and we paired it with a little stimulation of that nucleus basalis, and that released this acetylcholine in the cortex. And then when we checked the cortex, we found that, sure enough, the tone that we had used actually was processed by many more cells than it had been in the past. That is, the brain considered the tone to be important. But the real test of memory has to be behavioral. So the next day or so, we simply played a bunch of tones to the animal, but only one tone attracted its attention. And we know that because we were recording its ongoing respiration. And when we played the tone that had been paired with the stimulation, the respiration spiked, the animal paid attention and got very aroused. Turns out, though, that the animal's memory is content-free in terms of motivation because acetylcholine doesn't have any motivational significance. It has this ability to make things work better. So we're pretty sure that the animal's memory is something like, well, that tone is really important, and I don't remember why. And because it didn't get any reward, for example. And it's very specific because no other tones produce the same response. And there's always a match between the number of cells that increased in the cortex and the particular sound that the animal regards as now really important to it.
Had these these rats, been involved in any other behavioral experiments using sound?
No, that's a good question, because if they had, then it would be difficult to interpret the results. No, we have total control over their auditory experience, but we also have a bunch of other control studies. For example, if you give the same tone and you give the same stimulation to the nucleus basalis, but you give them randomly, not paired, then the animals never form a memory at all.
Was the tone that you chose in the normal range, or was it a shrill? Was it a tone that would normally cause a mouse pain, or it would have to strain to hear, or unusual in any fashion?
Yeah, no, the rats don't react to these tones. In fact, if you give them a few times, the animals will just go to sleep. So no, the tones themselves have no motivational significance, and there's no fear, pain, or anything like that involved.
And as you said, you did not pair it with any type of positive reinforcement or anything that might trigger it in any normal way that you would think would induce a memory or a behavioral response.
No. Those are some of the control experiments we'd done over the past 10 years. Just we wouldn't have gone this far if we hadn't cleared that one up. So no, this is a pure creation of a memory without any emotional overtones.
What you are doing, though, is creating an event and then making sure that event is memoried. You're not necessarily holding down the 3 notes of the chord inside the brain, having never played that note, right?
If I understand your question, I'd have to agree with you.
Let me rephrase. When you described how the human brain or how the rat brain understands music, you made me envision 88 keys on a piano, right?
Sure.
And it is possible, I imagine, that if we had 88 keys and we knew which key corresponded to which note, I could hold down a C, an E, and a G and make a major chord,
Yes.
without
Yes.
ever having played any music. And if
Right.
I hit that chord inside the brain, then perhaps the brain would know that note having never heard it. But that's not
Well,
what happened here, right?
in theory, we could have done that in this case, but you'd need the nucleus basalis to be paired with the notes in order for the cells to have become plastic and increase their response to those three notes. The reason we use a single tone rather than a chord or a complicated natural stimulus is because you have to start someplace, and so you start with something you can completely control and which is well understood, and that is how the brain processes single tones.
Would this technique, can it be used for things beyond auditory tones at this point?
There would be no problem in creating new memories with more complicated stimuli. The problem would be that since no one knows how those stimuli are actually represented in the brain, you wouldn't be able to look at the brain and say, aha, it works this way because that part of the brain changed in a certain way. That's the whole reason for using the simple stimulus, because we can take advantage of the fact that we know how pure tones are represented and processed in the auditory system.
So it's a software problem at this point. We don't quite know the programming language in order to create an image or to create a more elaborate memory, but we do have the language right now to program in simpler things like a tone or maybe a burst of light.
Yes, essentially, one just needs to get more information about how sensory systems represent complex events rather than simple events. And that'll happen. That's a natural progression in the field of sensory physiology. But since it wasn't there yet for us, we stuck with the simple tone that we could control so that we could understand how the nucleus basalis managed to help create this memory.
Want to move into the dystopic question, the ethical side of this, because I'm certain many of our listeners, and I'll admit I myself who've seen far too many science fiction movies, when they hear about your work, we think of Total Recall and we think of other movies or stories in which memories are implanted and personalities are changed. We're probably not at the stage yet where those ethical issues are really prominent, but how do you wrestle with them at the moment?
To begin with, I think everyone has to realize that there's a very inexpensive and easy way to implant ideas in people's heads, and it's called advertising.
I can't argue with that.
Right. So with that aside, of course, I mean, all knowledge can be used for good or used for not good. That's just inherent in the nature of information. And the problem has always been to make certain that it's not used for ill. Society really has never come to grips with that in toto. It can't be left to the individual scientist because the findings have to be made public. So once they're in the public domain, the laboratory that created the findings has no control over them. This is a fundamental problem. But to keep the findings secret because they might someday be used for ill wouldn't allow us to advance knowledge or cure disease or any number of things. This concerns me as a scientist. It should concern every citizen because it's not just scientific findings that can be misused.
Where do you hope that this research will lead?
Well, there's always the hope, of course, for application to human dysfunction or memory problems. That's the reason we study learning and memory. It's not idle curiosity. It's to better the human condition. So there's always that hope. At the same time, that has to be tempered with the realization that we're at the beginning of a very, very long journey. And while, the public is understandably impatient about getting solutions to health problems and so forth and so on, there's really no shortcut. You have to do the fundamental basic science. It's not all that different in concept from getting your car fixed. If the mechanic can't look under the hood and know how it works, how is the mechanic going to fix it? Now, the brain is just like that, except I wouldn't say it's infinitely more complex, but it's a lot more complex. So that's the reason for all of the research. That's the motivation behind all of it. But memory is fundamental to the human and animal condition. Without memory, we wouldn't have any identity. We wouldn't be who we are or know who we are or be able to profit from experience. So memory is a bit different from a lot of other processes. It's absolutely at the central core of an individual's existence.
So one possible benefit of this research is a reverse engineering. If we know how to implant memories, maybe we can find out why they disappear and why it happens in cases of dementia or Alzheimer's or other neurological conditions?
Yes, certainly. But you have to know how things work before you can fix them.
Looking at a principle which may add to our memories. I'm Andrew Hiller for the Prism, and I've been joined by Norman Weinberger. He's a research professor of neurobiology and behavior at UC Irvine. Thank you so much for your time and for your work.
Thank you.